Here's a nice little video on validity to iron out some points that might not be perfectly apparent in the Sarago materials. First of all, we're going to be focusing on 4 different types of validity. We're going to be talking about content, construct, criterion concurrent, and criterion predictive. Now, these are all different ways of looking at validity. Validity is the idea that you are seeing the truth. It is the most important measurement concept because if you don't have it, you really don't have anything. When we think about the different ways that the truth can be true, which is funny to think about, it has different faces or different facets. And as far as assessments go, we want to make sure, one, that the content in the test is actually the content that we're trying to assess. So in a math test, say, I want to make sure that they're math problems of the right kind. In a social studies test, I want to make sure that if I'm testing about the Revolutionary War in America, that's what I'm testing about. And again, this is if I'm doing some kind of sit-down paper pencil test, or I'm doing some kind of project. Now, in any case, again, it can be the same for art, music, whatever. The content needs to be there. I also, when I think about the construct, I want to make sure that I'm not testing a bunch of other things. Now, a construct, to get ahead of myself, is something that we measure, but we can't do it directly. So things like intelligence, knowledge, happiness, all constructs. We want to make sure that I'm not measuring a bunch of other constructs that I don't care about. For criterion and concurrent validity and criterion predictive validity, the key things that we're talking about here is that how do I know that I have the truth? So when I'm thinking about my assessment results and how I'm going to use them, the main question that I have is, well, are they any good? And if they are, how do I know? Because I kind of made all this stuff up, right? And I need to validate it in some way. So as we go through, content validity is all about the content, the standards, the curriculum, the goals, my materials, my instruction, and my assessments all need to be in lockstep. Anytime you have a mismatch between any one of these things, you have a problem with content validity. So now, when I'm thinking about my instructional goals and thinking about what am I actually going to teach, right? Typically, a district will have some kind of district standards that reflect the state standards, and they'll give you a curriculum. Sometimes you can make it up yourself, but sometimes it's given to you. Now, when we think about, right, what your instructional objectives are going to be, you're going to base your daily goals off of those materials. And sometimes the goals are going to be given to you. And then you have to make sure that the materials that you're using fit those goals, and the assessments you give, if they're not given to you, actually fit the materials, the standards, and your instruction. And there's a whole bunch of ways that this can get out of whack. So when you teach, you need to make sure that whatever it is you're doing reflects your goals, which should be reflecting the curriculum that you're given, the standards, and any materials you have, right? Now, when you assess, you want to make sure that you are assessing those things that you taught or those things that you were holding the students responsible for learning, but they still had access to that kind of information. So again, teaching should reflect your goals. Assessment should reflect what you have actually taught. When you get out of this, any divergence creates some kind of mistake in the conclusions that you're going to make about what your students can and can't do, what they've learned, how effective your instruction was, and all that stuff. So we want to make sure that we spend a lot of time thinking about how these things are aligned. And we're going to spend most of our time thinking about instructional goals and assessments, right? Because those are the things that you have the most control over. Can't control the standards. You don't have much control over the curriculum you're given, but the goals and how you teach and what your assessments are really up to you. When we think about some situations that cause problems, right? Say your school adopts a new curriculum, but you use the same old tests. This is a content validity issue because you're not testing the new content. There are new standards, there are new materials. You probably are teaching things differently, so you can't use the same old tests because you're going to have some content validity violations. That assessment or that test will not be a valid reflection or a true reflection of all those other parts. For another example, a school's activity closing occurs and you skip a lesson or two, but give your test as though you went through them anyway. So, right, sometimes you will have fire drills interrupt things. Sometimes you will have snow days or school cancellations. That means you have to adjust your assessment if you don't have the extra time to build in extra coverage. Anything you skip needs to be removed from that test. Likewise, anything you add needs to be added to that test. 3, you have instructional goals that you miss getting to because you run out of time. So you have 10 objectives that you wanted to do over 10 days. People are getting stuck, right? So what do? You cut an objective or two. What this leads you with is a test that now does not reflect what happened in instruction. Another case is that you have an application goal, but you teach and test at the recall level. This is really a content validity issue. It could also be considered a construct validity issue. I'm going to talk about it more as a content validity because it is part of the objectives. And so I want to make sure that we keep this in mind when we are making our objectives, providing our instruction, and giving our tests. 5, you disagree with the school's curricular choices or new standards, and so you do things that aren't part of the new standards of the new curriculum. And so you are teaching at a much higher level, focusing on conceptual understanding rather than factual recall, but yet the district test is all on those little facts that aren't really that important. This is a content validity issue. And so any of these will bring you out of alignment. And anytime you're out of alignment, you have a content validity issue. A second type of validity is criterion validity, and this is the one that's split into concurrent and predictive. And the issue here is about really how much the results of different assessments agree. Now, when we talk about concurrent validity, we're talking about measuring a construct or knowledge or student skills at one time. And now this time doesn't mean the same instant, but I'm not trying to make a prediction about the future. I'm trying to just gather evidence of the state of affairs now. Predictive validity is when I use the results of one assessment to try to project or predict what's going to happen on another assessment. And so in this case, we're both using, or both of these concepts use multiple sources of evidence. But in concurrent validity, it's trying to assess what are things like now or over the past 6 months. Predictive validity is always about what is it going to be like in the future, or even if both things are in the past, did pre-test scores at the beginning of the year predict post-test scores at the end of the year? Did college entrance exam scores predict college success after students have graduated or gone through their freshman year, right? Those things will all be in the past to test this thing, but we're looking to see whether or not there is a predictive relationship. And if there is, that works. So when we think about concurrent validity is high when multiple sources of evidence are in agreement. So again, if I'm trying to think about how well my students are understanding concepts, I'm going to look at homework grades, I'm going to look at class participation, I'm going to look at classroom assessments, course grades, and standardized test results, all as different ways to see whether or not they get science, math, social studies, language arts, or whatever I'm testing. I'm going to use a whole bunch of different sources of information. Even within homework, say I can do this too. I look at multiple assignments and see, did they get it right here, 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 and here? Are they writing well in each case? Are they taking direction? Are they demonstrating they understand the scientific method in multiple occasions, right? Knowing that some learning is going to be occurring, and so I'm going to have a moving target. But in general, how well do all my assessments agree? Concurrent validity is low when you have different sources of evidence that give you conflicting results, where one or all of these things don't make sense. Kids who do well on homework bomb the test, and kids who do poorly on the homework ace the test. That doesn't make any sense, right? Class participation, not a great indicator of success always, but sometimes, right? Kids who don't participate seem to do well. Kids who participate do poorly. And, a lot of times you'll be getting evidence, in your classroom, and then you look at a standardized test and you find that things are very different. Sometimes kids who do really well in the classroom do really poorly on the standardized test. And sometimes kids who do really poorly in class do really well on the standardized test. In the first case, typically you have students who need a lot of kind of hands-on, active learning. They need consistent feedback. They are not good at just sitting down and staying focused, or they have test-taking anxiety, and so you see a huge drop-off when they actually take the test. In other cases, you have some kids who don't like to participate, who aren't shy, who are bored, or who may not think that school is all that fun, right? But they want to show what they know, or they want to prove that they're smarter than their friends, and so they take the standardized test and they do really well. In this case, right, it's just an issue of the classroom environment not really being a motivating, a motivator for the students in the right way. So if you want concurrent validity to be high, you want all your assessments to agree. Now, reasons why concurrent validity can be low are many, right? One reason is that the assessments are not really measuring the same thing. Now, this can be an issue of content validity when we talk about the coverage of material or the level of cognition. It can be a construct validity issue, and we haven't gotten to construct validity yet, but this idea that I'm measuring other things, like say I'm trying to measure math ability, but I'm also integrating your ability to use tech, your reading ability, how neatly you write, and so on. And therefore, I'm doing that on one test. It's not being done on the other test. So of course I'm going to get different results because I'm measuring different things. 4 of the assessments have different characteristics that make it more susceptible to guessing. And this is a reliability issue we're going to talk about next week. 5, the grading system is unreliable and overly subjective, meaning that I have different raters in different cases. This is also a reliability issue that we'll talk about next week. Or the assessment conditions are different, meaning that, right, one's in the morning, one's in the night, matters a lot, especially for teenagers and young children. When we think about the location or the situation, right, the overall kind of testing environment, right, doing your homework at your kitchen table is different than taking a test while the teacher's staring at you, or doing the whole standardized test thing. That could be an issue. Testing conditions matter. Not much, but they matter. The student is in a different state, meaning not Wisconsin versus Illinois, but they're really tired in one case, or they're stressed out, or they're angry or distracted, or they're sitting next to their best friend and they keep giggling and talking, or they're cheating, right, in one case and not in another. These are all reasons why you might get different results. And this is a really interesting philosophical thing, right? Because how do you know what's the truth? How do you know what is actually giving you the correct answer, right? And a common way to think about this is, right, when you go to the store and you buy, say, a tape measure and you want to measure something and you get, it's 10.5 inches. How do you know it's really 10.5 inches? Or how do you know it's really a meter? Because I have several rulers in my house and they don't line up exactly the same. And when I'm building things, it matters when I'm a 1/16 of an inch off or a 32nd of an inch off. And so I have to make sure I use the same measuring equipment all the time. Otherwise I find, but the question is, which one is the right one? Doesn't really matter for building, I just have to be consistent. But if I wanted to know which one was the right one, how would I know, right? And so in that way, I need some kind of multiple data source approach to figure out whether I'm close to the truth or not. When we think about predictive validity, right, It can be high or low depending on a variety of factors. One, if the time between both assessments is short, I will typically have higher predictive validity. When the time between assessments is really long, I get lower validity. I want to make sure the formats of assessments are very similar, multiple choice and multiple choice versus multiple choice or an essay, right? I want them to be well aligned. All the content should be the same, and tests don't always do this perfectly, especially if I'm wondering if like pre-algebra tests predict calculus tests. Well, those are different content areas, one. And even if I was doing pre and post tests in algebra 1 or pre and post tests in science, I better make sure that those tests are equivalent. Otherwise, and not out of alignment with each other, otherwise I'm going to get bad results. I also want to make sure that there are no other knowledge, skills, or abilities that are involved in each assessment, right? And this is a construct validity issue. Again, we'll get to that in a minute. But if I'm measuring a bunch of other stuff, like how personable you are, how quick-witted you are, whether you can think on your feet, whether or not you can stay motivated in one case, and in the other case I'm measuring none of those things, well, of course I'm going to get different results. The motivation of the individual is likely to be the same. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that I want to make sure that in both cases, the person's trying as hard as they can. Some students try a lot harder on their homework than they do on standardized tests, or vice versa, right? And so when I'm thinking of any situation where I'm trying to get knowledge about my students, one of the assumptions that most people have is that everyone's trying their hardest. And as you well know from your own experience, probably in your own effort, you don't always try your hardest at everything. And so that might be a difference. Finally, the conditions of assessment are likely the same or are close to being the same, right? I want to make sure that assessment situations for classroom tests are consistent with homework conditions, are consistent with standardized tests. And as those things deviate, which they will, I will likely get lower and lower predictive validity. So here are some examples of criterion validity, both concurrent and predictive. And say we're trying to answer some questions in our lives. The students' ratings of teachers reflect teacher quality. Well, the concurrent picture of this, right, is that I have multiple sources of evidence. I have, say, peer observations of teachers. I have principal observations of teachers. I have student ratings of teachers. And I want to know whether or not all these things kind of come together and tell me the truth about whether or not a teacher is doing a really good job in the classroom. The second one is our self-judgments of a skill level, a true indicator of real understanding. In other words, when you think about whether or not you understand something, are the judgments you're making a valid indicator? Well, if I compare that to the actual test scores or expert judgments, I have a concurrent issue. And if I have a high level of agreement between, yes, when I think I know it, the professor or the teacher thinks I know it as well. When I don't think I know it, I don't know it, right? Or I don't do as well based on test performance or expert judgment. Those are concurrent validity issues. When we think about how that might be low, if I think I know it and then I do poorly, that's a concurrent validity issue, right? The state of your knowledge is open to interpretation, apparently, because there's an inconsistent result. It's because concurrent validity is low. If we think of other predictive ways we use data, we have the relationship between high school GPA and college GPA. We have the quality of lesson plans and the quality of instruction. We have interviews and first-year performance. In each one of these cases, we're trying to use one source of data to make predictions about another source of data, right? High school GPA and college GPA, lesson plan quality and instructional quality, interview performance and first-year performance. And again, when these things are all low, it's because of all those issues that we talked about: the time, the effort, the motivation, the content. the constructs that are being measured. And so we are going to think about construct validity then, because we need to get at this one. And this is one of the really big foundational ideas that I think is the most interesting. Now, a construct validity concerns the basic idea about whether or not you're measuring what you really want to measure. Specifically, it is all about the extent to which my assessment results allow me to identify what am I trying to measure, but also tell it apart from other similar things. Now, assessments, items and whole tests that are not or are supposed to measure the same thing should give me the same results. And assessments, items or tests that are not supposed to measure the same thing or measure different things should give me different results. And this is two parts of construct validity: convergent validity and discriminant validity. Convergent means, again, that things that are the same should come out the same in my measurements. But I should also be able to tell things that are related apart from one another. But first we need to think about what a construct is. A construct is something that we do not directly measure, but we have theories about what they are. Intelligence, wealth, happiness, success, wisdom, beauty, job satisfaction, marital satisfaction, health. All these things are things that we've kind of made up conceptually, and we all feel like we know what they are, but we can't see them directly. Things that we can measure directly are things like height, weight, color, mass, things like that. And color is a kind of an iffy one because I would need to define that as the wavelength of light. But I can do that directly. I can measure that directly. How much you weigh, I can measure that. How tall you are, I can measure that. And I can be very precise about it, right? Those things are all great, but the things that we typically care the most about are the constructs. And so we're going to talk about it in two different ways, just to give you an idea. But the key thing that I want you to take away from this is that construct validity is always about making sure you're not measuring a bunch of other stuff. So, for example, when I'm giving, again, a math test, I want to measure math knowledge. If I put in a word problem, I automatically fold in reading ability. If I have them do a project with group members, I'm also folding in the ability to work with other people, how cooperative you are, how organized you are. If you have to present it, I'm starting to fold in maybe some of your verbal skills and your presentation skills. And so I have to make sure that I keep my construct straight and isolated and don't let a bunch of other stuff get in the way. So we have these two ideas then within construct validity about convergent validity and discriminant validity. Convergent validity is the extent to which assessments that are supposed to measure similar concepts are related. And so you have, for example, an assessment that's supposed to measure the knowledge of pizza composition. When you think about all these questions here, the extent to which they converge or give me the same results because they're related to the same ideas or the same knowledge concept, right? That means convergent validity will be high. So I have things about, right, what are the different types of pizza crust, what kind of sauce can you have, types of cheese, and so on. And then how many wheels does a bicycle have, or how many wheels does a delivery truck have, whatever. Doesn't make sense. It's measuring a different construct. In this case, the construct is pizza knowledge, right? When we think of discriminant validity, right, even within a given construct, say of pizza knowledge, there are a bunch of sub-constructs, as in this example below. We have some questions about ingredients and some questions about baking instructions. Now, they're all part of pizza knowledge, but I have to be able to discriminate and tell apart, well, what are your strengths and weaknesses, right? What do you do really well and what do you need help on? Because that will determine exactly how I provide some kind of remediation. When I think about something else more concrete, again, math I always think is easy to talk about, so knowledge of fractions, right? So I have this broad construct of fraction knowledge. But within that, I have adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. And even within each one of those, I have additional subconstructs. So in adding, I have simple fractions, mixed numbers, irregular fractions, and so on. When I think about why I should care about this, it all comes down to this idea that as a teacher, you are trying to identify strengths and weaknesses of students so you can provide high quality instruction, right? It would matter to me, instead of just saying, well, you didn't pass knowledge of fractions, we're going to teach the whole unit again, that, oh, you just have a problem finding the common denominator in every kind of fraction problem, right? Or maybe you get adding, subtracting, and multiplying, but you're just having a problem with dividing. Then I can just focus on that. And maybe you're just having a problem in dividing irregular fractions for some unknown reason, right? So instead of teaching the whole gosh darn lesson over again, I can just focus on one little piece. And that's why we care about this. We want to also make sure that we're not folding in other ideas, other skills, knowledge, or abilities. So when I think about common things that might get in the way, if I'm giving you materials that are beyond your reading level and you just don't understand the words in the text, or I speak in using vocabulary that is beyond you, you're not going to do well. Not because you can't get the material, but because you don't understand the words. And you can say that if somebody's an English language learner or an emerging bilingual student, right? It's the same idea. You just lack the vocabulary. You can get the concepts, but either understanding it from the teacher of the text or expressing it might cause some problems. You can also think about inadequate time limits. In many cases, we are not worried about time. We don't care how fast you can do something. But in other cases, we do. In reading, for instance, when students are just beginning to read, you want to measure how quickly they can read a passage, because you want to make sure that decoding or turning the print into words in their head is happening fast, it's accurate, and it's automatic. Because if people are spending too much time thinking about decoding the word, they'll never get the meaning of the sentence. So you care about how fast people can decode. Similarly, in typing class, if anybody takes typing class anymore, it matters how fast or how quickly you can type. It also matters how accurately you can type, of course, too. But in many cases, we don't really care about the time limits. And so you want to make sure that that's not getting in the way if you don't want it to. Another thing is poorly constructed test items that include clues or unreasonable options. So in other words, that if I'm giving you the answer away, or I have other elements that make it really easy to guess, I am not going to be really measuring the construct I want to. I could have an improper arrangement of items. Time and motivation is affected by this. And what I mean by that is typically assessments in the sense of paper pencil assessments that you sit down and take in a class typically start with easier lower level questions and get harder as they go, and usually open-ended responses are towards the end rather than the beginning. Not always, but usually. Now this is done this way for a variety of reasons. If I start with a really difficult question or item or task, and it's the hardest one, if I lead with that one, people who are shaky are probably going to freak out. And they're going to spend way too much time on this. They're going to lose motivation and their performance will suffer, right? On the other hand, if I start with some easy things that kind of get people in the groove, build up their confidence, get them moving, they tend to, move through it a lot more easily. So I want to make sure that items are arranged appropriately. I also want to think about item response patterns. This is a form of clues, making sure that I'm not giving things away. I want to make sure I'm not requiring other skills such as cooperation, teamwork, tech ability, reading, writing, if that's not what I'm really trying to assess, neatness even, right? Public speaking. All these things are common things that people start putting into assessments and basing a big part of the grade off of, when it's not what you taught, it's not what you are teaching, it's not the content area, it really has nothing to do with your learning objectives. And so you want to make sure that you keep those things out. We'll talk more about this when we talk about performance assessments. Finally, subjective scoring systems that are susceptible to bias. When I am thinking about like interviews, right? Things that we have been shown to influence is your speaking voice, your physical appearance, physical attractiveness, personability, agreeableness. These are all things that impact how well you do in a job interview. And they have nothing to do with the skills you're supposed to be demonstrating, unless those are the skills you're supposed to be demonstrating. But usually they're not. But those are the things that kind of shift us off. You'll listen to a book excerpt where it talks about how height influences salary, and that every inch is worth hundreds of dollars per year. And so the taller you are, especially if you're a man, the better off you are. If you're a woman, it's a little more complex. Depends on the profession, and it actually you can be too tall as a woman, unfortunately, and then the pay scale starts to go down again. But those are all cases where the assessment system is susceptible to bias because of its subjective nature. So when we think of how do I find these things, anytime you hear anything about a mismatch between standards, objectives, materials, instructions, or assessments, think content validity. For construct validity, any instance in which you are not really measuring what you want to measure because either you have terrible indicators, so tools that don't really do what you want to, or because you're measuring a bunch of other stuff that they don't want to. Again, reading a level in a math problem, presentation skills in a science report, and so on. Now, the common thing that happens here is that people tend to get content and construct validity a little mixed up. And so the question I typically have is, how could I have high content validity and have low construct validity, and vice versa? So a case in which I would have high content validity, again, is if I have a math test that is full of word problems. They're all about math. We've practiced them in class and so on. However, if I throw some high-level vocabulary in there, complex sentence structure, and so on, I have now caused a construct validity issue. Say I printed in a different language, right? That's an extreme example. But again, now I'm not going to be measuring your ability to solve the math problems per se, but I'm going to be measuring your ability to read Swahili or Japanese or something like that. A case in which construct validity would be high, but content validity would be low, would be, say that I have a math test. Let me go back to this one here. And I'm measuring your ability to add fractions, right? Everything's good. I leave out my common denominator questions for whatever reason. Don't have time. Takes too long. I'm still measuring the right construct. Everything on the test is about the construct, but the content isn't there. I have a gap in my coverage, right? Say that I left out 2 of these, and I basically just had simple and mixed numbers. Again, construct validity is fine, but content validity is low. So I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about these different ideas. In terms of concurrent validity, things to look for: anytime you're using multiple data points to figure out where students are at a given time. Predictive validity is any situation where one source of data is used to predict performance on another set of data. Other things that impact validity that are really outside of things we've talked about so far: administration factors, grading time, procedures, resources, susceptibility to cheating. All those things will impact validity. Student factors like test anxiety, motivation. Again, these are more reliability issues that we're going to talk about next week, but there's still things that matter. Group factors. I don't mean group work here. I mean people's age, their race, their gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and so forth. Those can actually have a significant influence on whether or not an assessment gives me good results. We'll talk about that when we talk about bias. And then the relationship between the test and the criterion, or the thing that I'm assessing and the thing I'm trying to predict. Do they match up, right? We talked about the whole idea of job interviews and what you need to do well on those, and job performance and what you need to do well on that, just like kind of college entrance exams and success in college. They are two different things. It's a major construct validity issue in the sense that they're measuring two very different constructs. And so that's going to impact the predictive validity in any case. When we think about then, how do we go about validating constructs? We have this idea of construct validation. Construct validation focuses on content validity and purity. It makes sure that the construct is adequately represented and it's the only thing that's represented. So when you want to validate your constructs, first, define the domain or the tasks that you want to measure. What's covered in the assessment? How do they line up? Consider the problem-solving process. What exactly do the problems require the person to do? Consider what other factors influence the outcome. Make sure the assessment scores are improving during practice. You want to be sensitive to learning. And then check to see whether your results are reflected in other measures. This is the idea of concurrent validity, right? Going through this process are things that you should kind of do all the time. Right? When you're planning your assessments, you really have to think hard about what are my goals, and this is what we're working on right now. What exactly do I want my students to be able to do? How well do I need them to know it? How deep or how broadly do I need them to know it? Under what conditions do I want them to perform it? And then think about, well, what else do they need to do? What else might get in the way that I don't really care about? How do I get rid of those things? And then as you're teaching, right, you're going to be checking informally most of the time, right? But if you use pre-tests and post-tests formatively, right, you will be doing that in a much more rigorous way. But you'll be seeing, are people improving? Are they getting better? Are my assessments open to them getting better? Or do I have an artificial ceiling, top score that they can't go beyond, or floor, bottom score that they can't go beyond, that's limiting my ability to see changes? And then is this also reflecting other things? If everyone's doing well in my class, but they're doing terrible next year, right? When they take social studies 2 or algebra 2 or art 2 or whatever, right? Something's wrong, either with my class or their class or both classes or something, right? And I want to make sure that they do well in the standardized tests, district tests, state tests, entrance tests, and so on. If I find that things aren't on the up and up, well, then I have to reevaluate because somehow I've been bamboozled. I've been tricked, and I need to fix it. So that's a major outline of validity. We're going to go through some other exercises and some other practice problems, but these are the big 4 that I want you to focus on. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll put up a new discussion board, and if nobody posts, I'll assume everybody gets it. There'll be a few quizzes online as well.